Well, good morning, Father's House family. Welcome to our Sunday morning video again. I'm glad you could all join us. We are experiencing some decent weather, so we're still holding service outside. And as you can see, the Christmas season is upon us. Normally, we would be at the church on Saturday after Thanksgiving decorating, but we're not going to be doing that this year. We also would possibly be over at Linda's house making tamales, but probably not going to do that this year. So a couple of things that I did want to mention. The men's meeting is on break until after the first of the year. The women's group is still meeting on Zoom on Thursday nights at 6:30. We're on chapter 12 of Ecclesiastes. We're just about to finish that up, and then we'll probably find something else to study because we're really having a good time with it. Also, we got a notice from Sal that ran the farmers market here on Saturdays, and he is not going to continue with that. I don't know whether it was because we didn't have enough vendors or support. I'm not sure what that was, but he said that if he does decide to start it up again, we would be the first ones that he called. However, next Saturday, we will be having the Father's House flea market at the Father's House parking lot. So if you want to be a part of that, let Moses or Richard know, or let me know, and I'll put you in contact with them. If you want to sell your Christmas goodies that you've made, or you want to sell your decorations that you've made, that would be a good opportunity to do it, because the Christmas holiday is coming up, and I'm sure people will be out there shopping for that kind of stuff. That's all I have to cover today, so we'll turn the time over to Pastor Carl to talk more about King David.
Well, good morning, Father's House. As you can see, we're back in studio today. The last 2 weeks, we had to have that bland background that we had because we were in Scottsdale and for the holidays, and so we weren't able to record in the studio, which we always prefer to record here because I love this. My backyard. This is my backyard here, and who could not have a good life with a backyard like this, right? So anyway, glad to be here. I'm glad you're here with us today. Looking forward to talking more about David. But before we do that, I want to bring up tithe and offerings and our giving. Now we're starting in this next month. Giving has gone down substantially the last couple of months. And so I'm just asking you during this Christmas season, if you can remember the church, it would be greatly appreciated because our bills still continue whether or not we're in the building or not in the building. And I don't know if you know, but Pastor Roberto and their congregation, they've suffered some financial hardships as well. So even our rent with them is down to less than a third of what it was. So, and we wanted to be fair with them and to keep their church afloat as well. So anything you can do giving-wise would really be greatly appreciated. I just want to say thank you for all of you that can give and have given. And I know that some of you can't give right now. I understand that, or you can only give a little bit. We understand that, and we're with you. But there's something about when we give, we just feel better about ourselves too. So I hope that you'll take that to heart, and during this time, not just give to the Father's house, but maybe give to some other people that you know have a need. So anyway, that's all we really have to say about the giving. You can really give in 3 ways. You can give by check, and the address is below here at the Father's House, 133 Bernal Road, San Jose, California, 95119. Or you can give online by going to the fathershouse.org and pushing on the give button, and it will direct you to a screen where you can give. Or you can, if you're in the area and you want us to stop by and pick up a check, we'd love to stop by. We promise to social distance and just see your smiling, beautiful faces. And many of you we've missed so much that we haven't seen. So anyway, if you can do that, it would be greatly appreciated. Well, as said, we're going to talk a little bit more about David now as we're kind of moving forward. But before you get started, I know you probably have to have your coffee. If you're watching this in the morning or whatever it is, I've got my bubbly water today. It's sparkling grapefruit. It's pretty good. So I'm going to have a shot of that, and we're going to go on and we're going to talk about the life of David. I don't know if any of you have ever tried this bubbly water in the grapefruit, but it's mighty good. I like it. Okay, let's go back to King David. Now, as you know, on Sunday morning, Carlos has been ministering the last 2 Sunday mornings here locally while we were in the Scottsdale area, but I still ministered on TV. So anyway, 2 weeks ago, really, we started talking about the covenant that God made with David, right? And it was a covenant, remember, where David was at the zenith of his career, really, as a king. He had established Jerusalem as a capital. He had brought the Ark of the Covenant in, and he desired to where it was dwelling in Jerusalem. And then the third thing was is that he desired to build a house for God. So Nathan the prophet comes along, and God speaks to Nathan. He says, I want you to go say something to David on my behalf. And he said, David, you want to build me a house, and I appreciate the fact that you want to build me a house. And because your heart is so right, I'm going to build you a house. God, in other words, turned it on David. God blessed David. He says, I'm going to build you a house. And so from there, what he was saying is not just a physical house, but he was going to build David's dynasty through Solomon and then ultimately through Christ, as with Christ being of the lineage of David. So it's a very profound thing that happened. We talked about that 2 weeks ago. You can go back and look at the video if you want to, where I talked about it, if you haven't been a part of this series up to this point. But after the next week, which we talked about last week, we talked about Mephibosheth, and that was the covenant between Jonathan and David, where he basically wanted to take care of Jonathan's son because he wanted to do good to Jonathan because they promised to take care of one another's families in case something happened by way of death to one of them. And Jonathan, as you know, died with his father Saul. So where we are in David's life is David is at the zenith of his career right now. And so being at the zenith of his career, it was at that point that David then began to have this new problem come upon him. Now, we talked a while ago about once he didn't inquire of the Lord on how to bring the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem, and God wasn't pleased with that. And so Uzzah died in that encounter, and that was really on David, not on God. But now David's kind of got the ark back and everything's going well. And David has rest on every side. He's prospering and there's really no need for him to do anything. Everything that he wants, he ultimately has. But I just want to tell you that sometimes when we have everything that we want, what happens with us sometimes is we just want a little bit more, don't we? They kind of talk about Rockefeller. They asked Rockefeller when he would have enough money. And he said, when I have $1 more. He always wanted that one more dollar. And so that seems to be a human nature for us sometimes, that we just kind of act that way, don't we? So I've got a question to ask you. Have you ever found yourself in the wrong place, at the wrong time, and doing the wrong thing? Again, have you ever found yourself at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and doing the wrong thing? I would probably venture to say that each and every one of us have found ourselves in that type of a situation at least once in our life, if not a whole bunch of times. Probably for me, it was early on a whole bunch of times. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, doing the wrong thing. I remember when I was just out of high school and I was working for the phone company at that time. And I was taking out the phones out, it's called left-in units. I was taking phones out of houses that people had moved out of, apartment dwellings, out of commercial buildings. Because back in those days, which would have been 1975, 76, I guess it was 75, the phones were owned by the phone company. They weren't owned by you. They didn't have cell phones. The phone was actually the property of the phone company. So in order to get those phones back, and so they could refurbish them and send them back out and use them again, they had to retrieve those phones. And it was my job to retrieve these phones. It was a part-time job that I had through the summer of 1975. Well, there were some guys there that worked full-time, and they were the installers that would go into homes and install the phones. Well, I'd worked there for probably about a month and a half, and the boss really liked me, and I was doing a very good job. Well, there's about 4 out of these groups of installers that decided that one morning about 9:30, they were going to meet at a restaurant and they were all going to have breakfast together. Now, mind you, they were supposed to be in all different parts of the town, but they all decided, some of them to drive 10 or 15 miles to get to this location and all eat together, which they weren't supposed to do. Well, they invited me to be there as well with them. So I decided that I would go. So we were there and we were all having a good time eating lunch. And while we're eating lunch, everything seems to be going along very well. And all of a sudden, guess who walks in through the front door of the restaurant? Our boss. And so our boss walks in, and I want to tell you something. My jaw hit the floor. I went, oh my gosh, I'm in a lot of trouble here. And so the boss just looked at us and he said, "What are you guys doing here?" And the guy said, "Well, we're just here. We're eating our breakfast, and then we're going to go to work." And he said, "Well, I suggest you eat that quick and you get back on your routes at once." So, needless to say, we all ate quickly and we went back. We got in our routes and we took off and we went and did our own thing. But an interesting thing happened when I came back to the shop that night. The boss at the time, his name was Greg. I don't remember what his last name was. He said, "Carl, can I have a talk with you?" And I was the only one out of the group that he talked with. He said, "Let me tell you something. Those people that you went to lunch with, I can't fire them because they're unionized and they can do what they want, but what they were doing was wrong. They shouldn't have been there. They should have been about their business, and they chose to do something different than what they should have done. Now with you, you're looking to get on here full time. And so for you, it's a different circumstance. Not only that, out of everybody I've ever worked with, you're one of the hardest workers that I've ever seen. And yet today, that was a bad reflection on you." And I sat there and I realized that he was right in saying that. And I realized that I had been caught up in doing the wrong thing at the wrong time and with the wrong people. And part of it was because I wanted to fit in with the group. And if I got off on my own and said, "No, I'm not going to make it," then perhaps they would have shunned me or whatever. They would have marginalized me, and I wanted to be a member of the in group. At the end of the day, I look back on that experience and see it as a failure to some extent because I let other people direct me and emotions guide me rather than me using my reason to work through. So we're going to pick up the story of David, and David is in a predicament now where he's in the wrong place at the wrong time. He's going to do the wrong thing. I want to tell you that what we're going to look at, what David did, this event begins a descent in David's life. David's at the top of his curve now, leadership curve as king. But because of this event, David's going to crest, and the rest of his life is going to go downhill until finally he passes away. So we're going to pick up the story in 2 Samuel. If you want to take your Bibles and go there, get yourself another cup of coffee if you want to. Put it on pause, whatever you want to do. And we'll pick up the story and we'll read from there. It says, it's in chapter 11, verse 1. It says, "Then it happened in the spring, at the time that when kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him, and all Israel. And he destroyed the sons of Ammon and besieged Rabbah, but David stayed in Jerusalem. Now when evening had come, David arose from his bed and walked around the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful in appearance. So David sent and inquired about the woman. And one said, 'Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?' David sent messengers and took her, and when she came to him, he lay with her, and when she had purified herself from her uncleanness, she returned to her house. The woman conceived, and she sent and told David and said, 'I am pregnant.'" It's getting bad for David, isn't it? Then David sent to Joab, saying, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." So Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked concerning the welfare of Joab and the people and the state of the war. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." And Uriah went out of the king's house, and Uriah went out of the king's house, and a present from the king was sent out after him. But Uriah slept at the door of the king's house, and all the servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. Now when they told David, saying, "Uriah did not go down to his house," David said to Uriah, have you come from a journey? Why did you not go down to your house? Uriah said to David, the ark of Israel and Judah are staying in temporary shelters, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? By your life and the life of your soul, I will not do this thing. Then David said to Uriah, stay here today also, and tomorrow I will let you go. So Uriah remained the next day in Jerusalem. Now David called him, and he ate and drank before him, and he made him drunk. In the evening he went out to lie on his bed with his lord's servants, but he did not go down to his house. Now it came about that in the morning that David wrote a letter to Joab, sent by the hand of Uriah. He had written in the letter saying, place Uriah in the front line of the fiercest battle and withdraw from him so that he may be struck down and die. So it was that Joab kept watch on the city, and he put Uriah at the place where he knew there would be valiant men. The men of the city went out and fought against Joab, and some of the people of David's servants fell, and Uriah the Hittite died also. Now when the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah her husband was dead, she mourned for her husband. When the time of the mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife, and she bore him a son. But the thing that David has done was evil in the sight of the Lord. I know that's a long passage, and we're going to be talking about this for the next couple of weeks, but so you bear with me with it as long as the passage is, but I kind of had to read the whole thing. So what we find here is we find David in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now the story starts off saying that in the springtime, it was a time when kings went out to battle. In other words, it was the advantageous time for a king to go out and draw in battle array to defeat his enemies. Now David, because he had such a mighty army, decided that he didn't have to go because he could leave it at the competent hands of Joab. And he could do that. And that's exactly what he did. But it placed David in a precarious position because David was supposed to be on the battlefield with his army, but instead he was on the roof of his house and he saw a beautiful woman and he desired her. So what he did was he summoned for Bathsheba. Bathsheba came, they had sex, and lo and behold, she ends up and she's pregnant. Well, at that point, you're kind of looking, saying, what am I going to do? So David goes from this place of not being in the right place. And then he also finds himself tempted by this beautiful woman. And at the end of it, he lies with her and she ultimately becomes pregnant. Now, how many times have we heard the stories, or we know people that in their teens even, maybe they had sex with their boyfriend or whatever the case was, and they ended up pregnant. I mean, how many people do we know? We know that happens all the time. So why would David think that couldn't be something that would happen to him? So David does an interesting thing. He then begins to calculate how it is that he can get out of it. So he asks to have Uriah the Hittite sent home so that Uriah will sleep with his wife. And in that way, then she can say that he, her husband, got her pregnant. In other words, David's trying to cover this thing up. But the fact is that Uriah is such a man of loyalty and such a man of respect and honor that because the battle was being fought and he should have been there, he wasn't going to enjoy the comforts of home. David tried to cover it up a second night. He decided to try to get Uriah the Hittite drunk. Perhaps Uriah the Hittite, he would go home, he'd sleep with his wife, and everything would be taken care of, and David wouldn't have to answer for his transgression. But again, Uriah being the type of man that he was, what he ultimately does is he goes back and he sleeps out with the servants. And the next day, David knows that he's got to now cover up his sin in a different way. So what he does this time is, by the hand of Uriah, he gives a death sentence to his soldier, and he takes it back and delivers his death sentence without knowing it to Joab. Joab puts him on the front lines, and ultimately what happens? Uriah the Hittite is killed. And the long story short is David then, knowing that Bathsheba's pregnant, takes her as his wife and marries her. But the problem with that is simply this. The problem with that is that God wasn't pleased with what it is that David did. You see, David, in the first place, being in the wrong place, was tempted when he should have been somewhere else. I guess the question is how many times are we tempted when we're at the wrong place and knowing that we should be somewhere else and doing something else? It's almost like the idea of, let's say that you have a problem with alcohol and that you can't control yourself with alcohol. And so what happens is that you find yourself going out and hanging out with friends that are going to encourage you to overdrink. Well, when you put yourself in that kind of a predicament, how is it that you won't overdrink when your friends aren't helping you to overcome that problem that you have? And so sometimes we put ourselves in these predicaments and in these places where the temptation is there and it's so great that we can't get away from it. But if we're not in those positions and we're doing what we ought to do, then we're not tempted by those things anymore. I think that's one of the biggest lessons that we have to learn in our lives when we're facing temptations of our own is number one is where should we be when we're being tempted by something or by someone or whatever the case might be. The second thing here that I think is important for us to realize is the idea of when we let our desires overrule our thinking about what we're doing. And that's a big one for us because it's like with my sons and my daughters growing up. How many times do you think I had to say to them, now just what were you thinking when you decided to jump off that whatever, that mountain or the back of a truck or something like that? Here's an example of that. So when my sons were in high school, my son Michael decided that they were going to go out and they were going to get on on the bed of a truck, on the rail of a truck, and they would call it truck surfing and street surfing. And so what happened is they get on that little ledge, and the driver would try to throw them off the truck going 15 miles an hour down the street. Well, there was a bunch of kids in the back of the truck, and one of the kids was just standing in the back, and the guy gunned it, and he took off, and the guy started to fall back. And as he fell back, he fell out of the truck, and he hit his head on the curb, in the gutter, and he died right there in the gutter. And my son came home white as a sheep, and he said, "Dad, you're not going to believe what just happened." So he told me the account how when this guy fell out of the back of his truck, his eyes were locked on my son, Michael, and Michael watched him hit the side and die. It shook my son up. But I had to say to my son, what were you thinking when you did that? I think that if David was to look back, maybe what David would say about himself is, what was I thinking when I let that lust and a desire for Bathsheba enter into my heart? But more than that, what was I thinking when I let that desire direct my will to sleep with her? You see, in that instance, he let desire overrule his mind, his reasoning ability. To realize that if he did that, number one, he could get her pregnant. And number two, as a king, it would look badly upon him. And number three, that his relationship with God would be compromised because of what it is that he did. And so what we find here is we find this gross failure in David's life for the first time. So we've got to kind of look at this and then see that not only was that there was this gross failure on his part, but next what happened was he did everything he could to cover it up. The first thing he did was he lied. He lied and sent for Uriah the Hittite to come back. And under this guise of wanting to know what's going on in the battlefield, he wanted to cover it up by having him sleep with his wife. I just want to tell you that whenever we try to cover something up, it doesn't really go away. Whatever we did is still going to affect us one way or another. It's the law of cause and effect. But what happened was because of Uriah's loyalty, he didn't do it. The next thing that David did to cover it up was even more heinous than anything else he had done. And that was he had one of his mighty men fall in battle because of David's sin. Uriah did nothing wrong. But sometimes when we do something wrong, it's the innocent that suffer. When a mate decides to step out on when a partner, a married partner, decides to step out on his mate, what happens oftentimes is a divorce result, and the innocent children are the ones that are hurt. In this case, what we're going to see next week is we're going to see a couple of things. We're going to see that there is going to be the innocent child that's going to pay the price by death. But also what we're going to see is how it impacts David's life over the next couple of weeks. We'll be talking about it. How it is going to impact David's life for the rest. The key to understanding this is simply to understand that sometimes before we do things that we desire, if we just stop and think about them long enough and rationalize about them long enough, then we'll set our will in motion to do the right thing. And sometimes what we do is we so eagerly and easily jump into pleasure, and we don't realize what the ramifications are going to be. I guess the question I have to ask you today, and ask myself, is have I learned to use my reasoning skills to reason what it is I'm going to do when temptations arise and come at me? Because if I can think it through rationally, then maybe I give myself a better chance of making the right decision. David, in this case, didn't make the right decision, and as we're going to see, it cost him dearly. But here's the good news about the story that we're going to talk about next week. Next week, we're going to talk about the crossroads where the discipline and the grace of God meet. And what I want to say is that if you found yourself with a broken life because of something that's happened along the lines of adultery or because of addictions or whatever the case might be, I want to tell you that next week we're going to talk about the gracious, forgiving love of God, and yet at the same time knowing that there is a price that's going to be paid because of what we've done. It's not that God is going to do something to us. It's just the fact that whenever we do an act that is that wrong, the consequences will always be there. So I hope you'll join me next week as we talk further about David's life and about leadership lessons that we can learn from him to apply to our own lives. Let's pray. God, I just ask right now that you would teach us to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves when it comes to temptation. That, Lord, that when temptation comes our way, that you would give us the ability in our minds to rationalize it through and to choose to do the right thing, the good thing, the thing that you would desire for us all to do. So I thank you for this. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, God bless you, Father's house. We'll talk more about David next week. And I promise you, David's situation is going to get better in the days to come.
As we've been talking about other ways to worship, and the Christmas season is coming upon us, I found a quote from Dr. Howard Thurman that I'd like to share with you this morning. And it's regarding Christmas. He says, "When the song of the angels is stilled, when the star in the sky is gone, when the kings and the princes are home, when the shepherds are back with their flock, that's when the work of Christmas begins. To find the lost, to heal the broken, to feed the hungry, to release the prisoner, to rebuild the nations, to bring peace among brothers, and to make music in the heart." Very profound for Christmas season and what that means for us this year.